Hey there, it's Kelly from Kelly's Astrology. Today I'm talking with my friend and colleague Sam from unlockastrology.com. He's an astrologer based out of Newark in New Jersey. And I guess we got to know each other around the conference circuit a little bit, Sam.
That's right. That's right.
That's going back a few years now though, isn't it?
Yeah, I want to say 7 or 8.
That's what it feels like. I feel like I got to know you quite soon after I came to Canada.
Maybe, yeah. I mean, it probably hasn't been that long. Well, yeah, since 2012, right? You came to Canada?
I came in 2008 and then we had UAC in 2012, didn't we?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And then the SOTA conferences in Buffalo.
That's right.
We've done. And so I'm going to pick Sam's brain today about Venus retrograde, just to see what my Scorpio friend has to say about this subject. Oh, look at that t-shirt. Scorpio, what does it say, the year on it?
1967, yeah. Someone got that for my 50th. Yeah, someone got it, yeah.
I like it.
Yeah, what does it say? Perfect zodiac. Yeah.
Perfect zodiac.
I don't know what that means, but yeah, I was like, okay, I'll take it.
You'll take it. And Sam, you're a consulting astrologer like me. So you
That's right.
are talking to clients all the time. And I was really curious how another consulting astrologer is talking about Venus retrograde with their clients. Since we do have Venus retrograde, I guess probably I should give the dates. It starts on October 5th and it runs until, is it November 15 or 16?
I want to say the 16th.
The 16th. And it's mostly in the sign of Scorpio. That's happening in October. And then it'll be 2 weeks where Venus is retrograde in Libra in the first half of November. So I guess we're really going to talk about Venus retrograde in Scorpio today.
Right.
So what would you say about that?
Well, before I talk on the macro or the micro level, what it signifies for clients, because that will also depend on key aspects of their chart, right? Because if they don't have anything along the axis of Scorpio or Taurus, it may not be as salient for them in that particular way. Or if it's not like on the axis for Leo or Aquarius, where they have fixed signs and it forms a square. So it may not necessarily punch up things. And the same is true for those on the cardinal axis, when it goes into Libra. So I think that's important to take into account. But in the larger sphere, I'm fascinated by the Venus in retrograde because it seems to highlight more the disparity that we have between what we call us and them, right? In terms of, and this is something that Nick Dagan-Best, our colleague, has talked about in terms of race and looking at the cycles of Venus retrograde in relation to racial issues in the United States, particularly. That's where he focused. But I've come to see that Venus retrograde often lines up with a certain level of dissonance that we experience with other people, where somehow we realize we're out of harmony, out of connection with someone. So it's easy to find, those people more repugnant than other people who are in your circle. So Venus retrograde really does, because, every planet that retrogrades is dealing with a healing cycle, a renewal cycle for that planet. So Venus retrograde is where we're talking about how we deal with Venus themes, which deals with the powers of attraction, deals with how we have a sense of affinity and connection with others. So Venus retrograde is how we're reworking, retooling that. So on a macro level, we're dealing with that in terms of groups. And that was really poignant in the United States, at least, what we saw last week with the confirmation hearing for Brett Kavanaugh. It was interesting because I saw how polarized our nation is in terms of how people felt in particular about, sexual predators or sexual offenses and things like that, and the calls of assault. And also how people felt defensive on the other end of that. So I think that was one representation of the Venus retrograde. I think one thing that I often think about are the images associated with Venus retrograde, which does go more toward the personal. And this is some things I do talk about with my clients, particularly those who have Venus in Scorpio, because that is going to be salient for them.
Yeah.
One of the images I think about pretty frequently with Venus and Scorpio is the myth of Inanna and how she had to go into the underworld to confront her sister and basically be stripped of all her power and all her things. And I think there's something about that, because when a planet is in the opposite sign that it rules, because it rules Taurus. So when it's in Scorpio, it's under it's in Mars's house, Mars's domain.
Yes.
So being in Mars's domain, I think Venus has to kind of retool her mind and recondition her mind to deal with things in a Martian way. And that's not like, well, I gotta go fight. I mean, it could be some of that, but it's real. It's more so where she feels like, one, she has to get her power back because she seems stripped of those things. There's some kind of way in which she's dealing with a hurt, a pain, some aspect. And because it's a water sign, it's likely from the past. So some way in which Venus has been stripped of her power and authority, but she's on a journey to reclaim that. So I think the Venus retrograde becomes like a real powerful story of Venus having lost some things or the feeling of loss and coming to reclaim those things. And those things can be very specific. I mean, I gave the broad nomenclature of power or authority, but it could be literally some things you lost, like this dude stole my ring, or I lost my iPhone, or, or it could be other things that are less tangible. I mean, I feel like I'm losing self-respect in this relationship, or I'm losing self-respect at this job. And so there's things that, you're coming to reclaim and reauthorize. And I think that's one powerful message, especially for women. Venus is the quote unquote archetypal woman. So I think
a very strong feminine archetype.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, Venus becomes an important, her cycles especially become an important telling point for women. And for men, it's also dealing with their relationship with women. I think it's also important to think about their own sense of where they've compromised their sense of identity and integrity, their sense of worth. And I'm looking at worth more so not because Venus is just about worth, but more so the story she's telling us what's going through Scorpio.
Yeah, because Venus and Scorpio is a really interesting combination. You were talking about the dissonance and the discomfort. Like Venus has to sort of act maybe not in her preferred way as she journeys through Scorpio. And I loved what you said about it's almost like the recognition that you've lost power and then the journey to try and recover that power or reclaim that sense of control, I guess.
Yeah, when I paint the picture of Venus in Scorpio, I picture like a dainty woman, dressed, very conservatively, suddenly going into like a BDSM dungeon.
Right. I love it. So the twin set and pearls goes into the BDSM dungeon kind of thing.
And because Mars likes that, like Mars likes his, like his little chains and whips and things like that. And, and I'm not trying to get like pornographic or sexual.
No, but I mean, the other image I had, which would be very Marsy, is like the twin set and pearls showing up at a boxing match or something. Or street fight, whatever those type of martial arts fighting, where it's a very masculine, raw, kind of primal type environment. So there's that oddness, I guess, of maybe not belonging.
Yeah, but the difference I make, even though I'm not disagreeing, but the difference I might make, because I do think the tourney, the idea of the tournament, is more the Venus and Aries, because that's.
I was just going to say, that's actually more of an Aries thing, isn't it?
Right. Because with the Venus and Scorpio, there's an internal, your own threshold in relationship to pain, your own comfort around things that may cause pain to others, or discomfort, or how you kind of come to pleasure through the aspects of pain.
Yeah, I don't think we can dance around the fact that there is a sexual theme to this Venus in Scorpio.
Sure. Yeah, because whenever we're talking about Venus, we're going to talk about sex. And not just because Scorpio is related to sex. I mean, it's related to the sexual organs. But, one of the things that's happened in modern astrology is that Scorpio has been transmogrified into this, like, sexualized being.
Yeah.
Whereas we confuse the sex organs with just sexuality itself. But Venus is, by her very nature, Veneris. She is venereal. She's dealing with the things in love, the art of love. So dealing with the art of love from a Scorpio prism is more so like, oh, you know, love can be a battlefield. Love can hurt. Love can be pain. You know, life can be pain.
Yeah,
but
and
getting beyond that.
Well, sorry, Sam. I was
just saying, getting beyond that.
Yeah, because even in what you were saying before, that idea of us and them, I think even in the context of human relationships, that idea of feeling, are you together or on a team with your partner, or has there been some distance where you feel a bit separate from your partner? You almost feel like it's me versus my partner, or me and my partner versus, you know, a group or family or society or something. That us and them piece is really poignant.
And you know, one of the things I love about retrogrades is that then they push us to have to deal with work, because retrogrades are not so much about following nature's course as much as you're willing to kind of pave a course of your own. And with that, with Venus being retrograde, you have to kind of bridge divides on your own. You know, one personal testimony I can make, you know, independent of some of the themes I mentioned, is that Venus retrograded at 10 degrees of Scorpio. And my part of fortune is at 9 degrees Scorpio. My Mercury is at 11 degrees Scorpio. And I'm in a, just to get a little technical for your viewers, but I'm in a Venus perfection year.
Oh, lovely.
So third house, ruled by Taurus. So when Venus retrograded, I saw Venus was going to retrograde, you know, months back, I knew that this would be a window of time that would be challenging for my third house relationship, which is a sibling, right? So
of course,
I knew the window. You know, what your viewers may not know, so my brother just passed away. And so not that I could have predicted or wanted to predict that my brother would pass away sometime around the retrograde, but it prepared me. And it also prepared me for something important. You know, my brother and I had some differences. So it was during that time I attempted to work some reconciliation, which is a Venusian thing. Again, going with that us and them. And
trying to bridge that divide.
Correct.
Basically.
That's the work that comes with the retrograde.
So bridging the divides, that I guess when there's a divide between you and someone or something that is actually important, not allowing that to fester. And in your situation, it was a really time pressured environment because your brother was terminally ill. Correct.
So I think, and the other thing, like I cautioned my followers on Twitter, because I'm reading a very fascinating book, or I finished it, called Behave, The Best and Worst of Us, or The Best and Worst in Us Biologically, by Robert P. Sapolsky. And he's a neuroscientist and also a primatologist. So he's an interesting combination. And what was interesting is that he talks about a lot of things. It's a very long book. But one thing,
very Scorpio and intense.
Yes, it was. I mean, it took a long time because I was listening to it. It wasn't so much, and it was the kind of book you just can't listen to and just like be mindless, because he starts talking about different parts of the brain and, you know, sterocorticoids or this, and you're just like, what? What are you talking about?
So it's the kind of book that you're Googling, like, to keep up with.
Exactly. I'm looking at the appendix and I'm like, oh, what's this? And I'm even reading the appendix now. But one thing he talks about is how, in many ways, our brains haven't evolved yet to make a distinction between when we have metaphorical disgust toward a group of people and actual disgust. So for instance, we're more likely to make harsh judgments about other people if the garbage is stinking next to us, right?
Oh, interesting.
So there are ways
in a pleasant environment, people will make more pleasant judgments.
Correct.
Wow.
So our notions of disgust are visceral. And so when we start describing people in very disgusting, visceral terms, you know, like Republicans are maggots, Democrats are sheep. Well, sheep aren't disgusting, but are leeches, right? Things that are disgusting, our brains really start moving toward elements of disgust and repulsion, which in a propagandic, you know, using propaganda can lead to violent actions. In fact, he used as an example that blew me away, the violence in Rwanda. And I knew about the what happened between the Hutus and Tutsis in some not abstract sense, but I knew a lot of people died. But here's what I didn't know. In the course of 90 days, 700,000 people died.
Wow.
Right, exactly.
Wow.
And most of that happened because people would frame, and this is important, it wasn't like they were just gunned down or shipped off to concentration camps. Most times it was literally hacking people to death who were in intimate circles to you. Like,
wow.
You know,
yeah.
And whatever. So I'm giving this for a reason, because often the maligned group, the Tutsis, right, were framed as cockroaches, and cockroaches that would breed, with, good Hutus and all these people. So they were put in very disgusting, viscerally ugly terms. That's a good Venus and Scorpio lesson, right? Especially with the retrograde. Yeah. And I cautioned my followers on Twitter on how you're framing, quote unquote, the opposition, no matter what side of the divide you're on. Because once you get into less than human descriptions of people, or you're dehumanizing people, even people who, like, quote unquote, dehumanize you, right? Then you pave a path, right, toward certain kinds of, you pave a path for Mars, for more war, for more destruction. So I think Venus and Scorpio retrograde may almost be a warning, in the way in which we also can do the work differently in terms of how we frame and look at us and them.
Wow. So it's almost like an invitation to reflect on our language and our thinking around how we describe things that we don't like, or how we describe differences.
Correct.
Basically.
Yeah.
And to use maybe not dehumanizing language, I guess, to try and maybe stick to the facts, or rather than to use analogy, I guess.
Right. Or not to make the analogy so literal, right?
Right.
Because our brains, again, aren't hardwired to really make the difference.
To tell the difference. Yeah.
Which, I mean, it blew my mind. I was like, I think that's true. Because I'm always criticizing or critiquing anything. I was like, is that true? I was like, yeah, well, I can't think of strong enough counterpoints. And he, of course, gives a lot of the science behind it in terms of studies and things like that. So it's there. And so I was thinking about Venus and Scorpio, and thinking about even inclinations, and contempt. Sometimes when, on a more interpersonal level, when you're talking about your partner or you're dealing with particular issues, it can easily blend or bleed into contempt. And that's
what I was thinking too on this interpersonal level, with like colleagues or people at work, people in your extended family, friendships, and then of course in the dating, love, sex realm. Because in the Gottmans, in their relationship work, John and Julie Gottman in their Love Lab out of Seattle, which are like the premier standard of couples therapy, if you like, they talk about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, which are the 4 things that are incredibly destructive to relationships. And one of those, and one of them is contempt. Yeah. So tell us more, like, we should be conscious of this or avoiding this in our relationships, I guess.
Avoid it, or if it's there, it's like you said, the 4 horsemen have arrived, or at least one of them.
One of them has.
And it may be time to kind of walk away or think about your exit if you feel like you can't get beyond the contempt. I think it depends on when it's introduced in a relationship, and I think whatever horsemen are there.
Yes, whatever. I can't remember what the other 4 horsemen are, but whether it's just one alone. And I think with contempt, it also depends on how long it's been around and how often it's showing up. But it may lead to one of those, like, cliche Scorpio, more honest conversations about how being treated with contempt actually makes you feel.
Correct. Or how you're treating someone else with contempt, or, why that's coming up, and what you might be able to do, both of you, to work around it. Because if you're not conscious of it, and I think that's one of the best aspects of retrograde planets is to kind of illustrate for us where we're not being conscious, when we're flowing more on automatic. Because that's also the lesson with Mercury retrograde. You know, it's like, I always text Joe, and then Joe gets confused now when I text him during this retrograde. Well, because maybe it's time for you to do something else with Joe. Maybe get on the phone and call him. Same thing with Venus, you know. You know, you always kind of talk to your partner a particular way. Maybe it's time to think about how you might talk differently.
So that's actually almost a little empowering, that if there are things that aren't satisfying or pleasurable in our relationships right now, we can start to change the conversation. Whether that needs having the hard but necessary conversation about what you don't like, or starting to contribute something. Because I always think about, I don't even know where I got this idea, but relationships are actually more about what you give rather than you can get. And so I think the retrograde is a chance to reevaluate. Do you feel that you're actually giving into the important relationships in your life? And
that's a good point.
You know, try to get back into, because that just changes the dynamic when you start, instead of thinking this person has to do this on my schedule or according to my whatever, if you can offer something without that expectation.
That's, brilliantly said. Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, that is the nature of Venus, wanting to give and nurture sweetly, you know, bond, you know, like celestial oxytocin, you know.
That is fantastic. # celestial oxytocin.
Yeah.
Nice one, Sam. Because that is Venus. She wants to unify. She wants to pull together. That magnetism that's often associated with her is sort of her clue or her key to bonding. And I always think about, like, she is a moist or a wet planet. Traditionally, that's what she's known as. And what moisture does, it binds together.
That's right.
And we've got a wet planet, if you like, Venus, retrograde in a wet sign, because the water signs are all wet. So it is about how can we bind together or bond. And it's Scorpio, so it's got to be really honest and raw, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And that's what she has to get back to. I think there's ways in which she's lost that, you know, as the story might unfold, and she's coming back to that. And it's actually even in the astrology, because she's early enough in Scorpio, in the first decan of Scorpio, perhaps, that she ends up back home. You know, like, there's no place back like home, and she does end up back home.
Back in her home sign in Libra.
Right.
That's very true. Yeah. And so how do you think the retrograde vibe is going to shift when Venus does go back into Libra?
Well, I think it's going to calm down.
Okay.
You know, I think, you know, in the United States, we're going to be at the height of a particular divisive moment going into our elections, just 10 days before she comes out of her retrograde. She moves direct. Like I said, I think it's November 16th that she's direct back home. So that's 10 days after, you know, a pretty decisive and perhaps divisive moment in our history. And I think we can start some reconciliation and move our passions in a different way. At least that's a good hope. I don't know if that's going to be proved true.
Yeah.
But on a more personal level, I think one of the ways it also may manifest where, like, things have come out to light. So for instance, like, you learn your husband doesn't respect you, or you learn your wife is having an affair, or some other things. I mean, those are extremes, but maybe then you can kind of recondition, you know, like, well, are we going to save ourselves? Are we going to save the relationship? Also, I think it'll be important for people to figure out what's worth saving, you know, especially since Venus has come home, you know, like, what are the things that you can keep? What are the things that have been discarded that must stay discarded? That
need to be let go. Yeah, because one of the images that I'm working with this Venus retrograde is the idea of the compost heap. And it came out of the astrology podcast. Austin and I and Chris were talking, and Austin had all of his sewer metaphors, and I love the garden, so I'm always looking for garden metaphors. I'm like, this is the compost heap, and there are actually rules about what goes in the compost heap. You can't throw everything that is a food scrap in there. Some food scraps just don't decompose, and some food scraps will actually attract vermin, so you don't put them in the compost. there are certain things, like for instance, I don't think you typically put meat into a compost heap.
I was just thinking that. I was like, okay,
it'll just turn into maggots and become really destructive. So if the Venus retrograde is a chance to kind of compost emotional experiences from the past, we do have to kind of synthesize some, maybe we need to heal from and release because we don't want to carry them forward anymore. Some we maybe just, there needs to be a little bit more integration. But I like that idea of almost the sifting and the sorting, which seems very retrograde-y. You know, what is the wheat? What is the chaff in here? What can we keep? What can we repurpose? Because that's ultimately what a compost heap is. We're taking something that looks like garbage, but we're going to apply a particular process, and it's going to give us something that is going to create new life in the springtime, basically.
That's excellent. Yeah, I like that. I like the image of the compost heap, because that is very Venusian, right? It's in her other home in Taurus. So that's
yes. I always think of Venus and flowers and the garden and such.
Oh, it's beautiful.
It but it's like what you're saying is really that we're doing that composting at an emotional level in the realm of relationships for this Venus retro in Scorpio.
Yeah, and you know, people can do various things. You know, one thing, I was talking to Austin as well.
He loves a good chat.
Right. And one of the things that we talked about, especially in terms of making reconciliations, are mantras people can do, or if they're into magic, they can do particular hymns or spells, you know, attentiveness during a Venus hour on a Venus day, for instance. So for your listeners or viewers, you know, Friday is a Venus day, and then they can get an app to figure out the Venus hour.
Yeah. Do you have a website or an app that you love?
I don't know if I have a website. Hours? I know there is a website, but there is an app that I discovered recently that I think is really good. It only works with iOS though, so I don't have it for the Android. It's called Time Nomad.
Okay. Time
Nomad. Yeah, and it's really good, and it has a planetary hour. I know there are apps for the Android. In fact, let me check my phone.
Yeah, I mean, I often go to a website called lunarium.co.uk.
Okay, yeah.
And they have a whole bunch of stuff there, but they have moon phases and things like that. But they also do, in their planetarium section, they have planetary days and hours. So I often source that. And
Lunarium.
I guess Lunarium, yeah, so based on the moon. And I guess the key is when you find a calculator like that, you do have to just enter your location and your time, because planetary hours are not like clock hours. Correct. They are divisions of the length of day or the length of night. So there'll be 12 equal ones, but they won't necessarily be 60 minutes each.
Exactly.
And I think the trick is that Venus's day is Friday. So the first hour, the first planetary hour, starting whatever time sunrise is, will be the Venus hour on Friday. But the 8th planetary hour will also be the Venus hour on a Friday.
Correct.
And so that is usually in the afternoon, but exactly what time will depend on what season and what time of year.
Yeah, and I think the work, just to be clear, especially if from a magical point of view, even though I don't practice magic, I do know some things about magic, maybe not as much as Austin or other people. But what I would say, you know, when we're talking about doing this kind of work, it's more reconciliatory or more so making amends of things we talked about. I don't think this would be beneficial for spell magic. You know, like I want him to love me. You know, a Venus in detriment?
No, you definitely are not making talismans or casting spells for attraction in these Venus hours.
I just want to make sure that's clear.
Yeah, that's a really good point to clarify. I guess what we're saying is, in those Venus hours, time for contemplation or time for reflecting on relationships
or working on relationships. Healing existing relationships, but to kind of draw someone, or to be, wait until Venus is direct for the last little bit of Libra.
The last 2 weeks in November when Venus is direct in Libra will be much better for some sort of Venus magic type stuff.
Correct.
So I guess what we're saying is those Venus hours while Venus is retrograde, chance for reflection, healing maybe even, and even maybe some release work around if you're still carrying a lot of grief from a past relationship or from a betrayal that you've experienced, they could be the time when you are burning the things or doing a meditation or anything
Beautiful.
like that, I guess.
Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
That would be a good time to kind of, have a discussion with your partner or past partners, as you mentioned, or to, I'm going to keep it real, file a police report.
Venus in Scorpio, telling it like it is. And you know what? I laugh, but I have a personal experience of that immediately comes to mind years ago when a girlfriend of mine had broken up with her ex, and he was really having trouble letting go, to the extent that his behavior was kind of crossing into stalking territory.
Mm-hmm.
And another friend and I had to take this other friend of ours. We actually toddled off to the police station one night, the three of us, so that she could find out, what she should do in this situation where she actually felt really uncomfortable. And it wasn't a situation, she didn't feel that he would hurt her, but she still felt uncomfortable enough with him showing up in random places where he shouldn't have been, that she was. That, and I can't remember whether it was in Venus retrograde or not, but I mean, just to sort of illustrate the fact that it sounds like something you might never have to deal with, but then you do, and it's not that unusual, really.
Yeah, I think it's particularly important for women, not just to kind of pick on one particular gender, because I mean, issues can happen to men as well, but it's more likely to happen to women. And I think one of the advantages, I'm not someone who advocates for calling the police a lot anyway, but what I do believe is that it's good to have a record.
Yes.
If anything does progress, there is a record, and then that can also be used in the court of law, saying like, well, there was a complaint filed in, late October, then this happened in November, blah, blah, blah. And that does become good points of intervention if the law needs to get involved with someone who's particularly testy.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times, unfortunately, a lot of women, have their friends, family kind of talk them out of things, and things can progress. Especially if you're dealing with a potential stalker or someone who's been abusive. And there are ways in which the law can intervene, but there has to be, protocol and a record. It doesn't always work, but at least due diligence is a good thing to do.
For sure. And I mean, this does make me think of the myth of Inanna, I don't know why, that you were talking about, where she had to give up everything to kind of go and encounter her sister. And it also makes me think of the myth of Persephone, which is often, taught. I remember learning about the sign of Scorpio and learning about the planet Pluto, because my original training was in modern astrology. And I was taught that the myth of Persephone in association with that. And that's a myth of abduction. It's a myth of control. And so, not that we wanted to be depressing necessarily in our recording, but these are some of the darker shadow themes of the Venus retrograde in Scorpio.
Absolutely.
When we talk about power and control issues in relationship, we're not just talking in the kind of sort of functional normal zone, if that makes sense. We're talking, power dynamics that can get out of control or into the unsafe zone as well.
And that is one way, by reporting, by talking about these things. It's one way women can come toward power. It's interesting to me to hear, I don't know what the dialogue is in Canada, for example, but in the United States, it's interesting that people are framing people coming forward about, sexual offenses and sexual assault as being victims or, in a state of victimization. And that's saddening to me, because it's like, well, it's versus what, all those times where women had been assaulted and they just kind of kept their mouths shut. Are we going to pretend like, one particular candidate, one particular state, I forget now, where there's a woman going against a man, for office, and the guy is saying like, we're from pioneer stock who, the women were tough, and they just kind of do it. Like, tough toward what end, though? Just enduring craziness, just for the sake of craziness, or? And I think, one aspect you mentioned about Persephone, one thing that's not highlighted enough is that, yes, Pluto was a jerk. I'm using that clean language. I would want to call him something else, but Pluto was a jerk for pulling Persephone into the underworld and then holding her captive. But the story ends with Persephone as queen, as the underworld.
Yes.
So she
Because
does
she does sort of end up staying or participating.
Right, and participating and coming to her sense of power. And you can say, well, that's a warped, aspect of love. Well, I mean, love for the ancient Greeks with their gods was kind of warped.
It's an ancient Greek story. We're not in the realm of normalcy.
Right. It was kind of weird. But it does end with her, 6 months being with her mother, and then 6 months below, and then fully at all times being the queen of the underworld of Hades. So I think that's important, that, sometimes you have to go through hell and back in order to reign.
Yes, that there can be something of value that comes out of those difficult experiences.
Yep.
That they can be an opening or a way to access a strength or something inside you that may have gone latent, if you like.
Right. And that's true for many people who are born with the natal Venus in Scorpio as well. What I usually like to say to my clients is that, because people didn't naturally ask, like, if they're younger, like, well, if I have a Venus in Scorpio, am I going to be hurt in relationships? I don't think, our charts doom us in relation to our lives. I think they speak and have commentary on moments in our lives, because no one thing is true all the time.
That's a great point.
So I think the Venus in Scorpio may talk about how you experience a certain pain in a relationship that may not be like what others experience around you. Because because the argument could easily be made like, well, everyone has pain in relationships, Sam. But I think some people go through a unique relationship to it just by virtue of their own emotional makeup.
Yes.
And I think the Venus in Scorpio, if we could say mythos, is about that whole journey of how one deals with the pain and has to kind of reclaim that sense of self.
That's beautiful. That's almost like the essence of the whole retrograde.
Yeah.
And so for even those people who don't have Venus in Scorpio, there is a vibration coming through of that tone of Venusian energy right now. And whether we like it or not, whether we're used to it or not, we're all having to sort of maybe honor or play around in her space in our relationships for this.
Beautifully said. Yeah. Play around in her space. And her space is Mars's space. So it's kind of like a dark space.
It's definitely, I mean, if we're in the compost heap, we're in the ugliest part of the garden, essentially. Right. We're not sitting amongst the rose bushes smelling something beautifully fragrant. We're in, I think about my parents' compost heap. It's in this like weird corner up by the fence. And my dad goes to turn, because you've got to turn the compost heap so that the nitrogen and the heat gets in. And you don't usually want to get too close at certain times of the year because it can be a bit on the nose.
Right. On the nose.
On the nose. So, Sam, any other tips that you would have for people around Venus retrograde and just navigating these few weeks?
Well, first, one Venusian thing is to also be mindful of yourself, be mindful of self-care. The reason why I'm starting with that is once you kind of can be kind to yourself, then the hope and the aspiration is to extend that kindness toward others without having to compromise your own views, perspectives, or truth. But it is kind of not allowing that divide between quote unquote them and us become so vast and so hard and so inhuman and inhumane that you lose all regard for the other in order to vault the self. You can start with vaulting the self in kinder ways and think how you can extend some measure of that kindness. So for instance, even with someone you don't like, you can say, listen, this conversation is making me stressful and stressed. I'd rather not have it with you. I'm going to leave.
Yeah.
Rather than saying, you're an idiot. All people who think like you're idiots are vermin, because that's not helpful.
So it's noticing that reaction, and instead of projecting it externally, almost acknowledging that there's an internal emotion that's going on and doing something to honor that rather than like spraying it out. Yeah.
Right. Because I think that's one vital lesson of that. And I think that will will help. You know, so I think that sums up some of the
That's
things.
beautiful.
The couple of steps that we've gone through, but I think that gives the essence of it.
That's beautiful. I love that. I think that's going to be really helpful for people. And let us know as you guys are watching if you have any comments or questions. Sam, you're at unlockastrology.com. Do you have anything coming up that you want to tell our viewers about?
Well, I'm planning on having classes, resuming classes on level 1 and level 2. So what level 1 is for beginners and level 2 is for intermediates.
Excellent.
So that will start again in November.
Great.
And also check out their November horoscopes at tarot.com.
That's right. Sam's writing for tarot.com. So you can get your horoscopes there.
Right.
And you'll have classes starting early November, online astrology classes.
Yeah, online that you can use just through Zoom, just like we're doing right now.
Perfect. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Sam. I should quickly mention 2 things at my end. I've got my first year ahead retreat coming up in Palm Springs in January 2019, which you can sign up for via the Astrology University website. There's a link on my website, kellysastrology.com, if you want to just make it easy to find it. And my next online astrology class is actually on relationship astrology. It's an intro to the techniques of synastry and temperament, as well as timing in relationships. We'll be starting with our live Zoom classes on Monday, October 29th. So you can sign up via my website for that too. So Sam, I look forward to seeing you again, maybe online, because I think it's going to be a few months before we're in person together.
Yeah. And you know, I thought maybe I was talking with you about getting the soda. Because I was hoping maybe, you know, if I came in town for my brother's birthday, but I'm coming just the week. Well, yeah, the week before you're scheduled to be in Buffalo. So I'll get Buffalo ready for you, but
thank you. I'll miss you. But will you be at NORWAC next year?
Yes, we'll be at NORWAC.
We should give a shout out to the Northwest Astrology Conference, Seattle, end of May 2019. It's one of our favorite conferences. We will both be there. You're speaking there as well, Sam, right?
Yep.
Excellent. Yep. So until then, everyone, catch us online and we'll see you soon.
Thank you.